Live. The little thing is spinning and it says we are live.
Oh, jolly good. Live and going to England any moment now.
Yeah, well, you're not physically going to England.
Oh, you never know.
You never
tell with me.
No strings on end. welcome, everybody, back to another TeaFlix Tuesday. Thanks for joining us. And today we have a fascinating young gentleman who is all the way from England in the Bedfordshire, rather posh. Yeah. Sort of a bit Downton Abbey where he lives. Andrew Cook. He is a historian, researcher, and author whose 15 books have been published in 7 languages. My. He is the author of the international best-selling books Ace of Spies, the authorized biography of former MI6 master spy Sidney Reilly, To Kill Rasputin and Murder of the Romanovs. All of his books have been either the subject of TV documentaries or motion pictures, which I have lots of questions about.
Yeah.
So although February 1963 marked the Beatles' breakthrough in Britain, by the closing months of that year, they still had not conquered America. Brian Epstein had been fighting what seemed like a losing battle to persuade Capitol to release the Bounce records in America, which is just unthinkable when you figure it out now. How did a chance encounter in Denmark Street eventually force Capitol Records' hand? Well, we're about to find out from our master spy investigator, Andrew. When the Beatles eventually hit the big time in the US in February of '64, both Epstein and Capitol executives obscured the true story about how this had happened. We're going to spill the tea here today. However, corporate and personal archives now reveal the reality and much more besides. The lid is also going to be lifted on the fact that Capitol viewed the British record industry as being 30 years behind the times, and this is 60 years ago, and set out to remix the UK master tapes and create distinct US albums. While Capitol's strategy made the Beatles rich beyond their wildest dreams, Brian Epstein is shown as often struggling to balance Capitol's commercial decisions against the Beatles' own demands. He was, once again, poor Brian, piggy in the middle.
I know, yeah.
This fabulous book, Capitol Gains, also explores Capitol's PR efforts to protect the Beatles' image as they get caught up in the whirlwind of worldwide success. So today's guest of TeaFlix Tuesday, which is, as you know, sponsored by Mrs. McCartney's Teas, welcome all the way from UK, Andrew Cook.
Right. Hi, Andrew. Hello, Dan. Nice to see you.
You too.
Absolutely. Nice to be seen.
Good evening for you, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Fabulous. So just going straight off the bat from my introduction.
Yeah, what I was wondering, with your background and all your other types of books, what first drew you into the Capitol Records aspect of the Beatles?
Sure.
How did genealogy play a part in the genesis of this book?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that question. I mean, the first thing was that, almost from as far back as I can remember, and it must be about 7 or 8 years of age, I was a Beatles fan, and that was partly because my 2 cousins who were 10 years older than me were kind of growing up with that. So, I was sort of sitting next to them in the bedroom, listening to their records and everything. I suppose the other thing that people often ask me, which is kind of similar to what you've just asked, which is, look at the other things I've written. What the hell is the connection between those, Rasputin and the Beatles? I suppose the quick answer is there isn't one, but underneath the subliminal answer is that almost everything I've ever written has been as a result of finding new material, often things that have been locked away or hidden away or just, upstairs in people's lofts. People talk about archives, people talk about, going to the National Archives and this, that, and the other. Yeah, of course, they're very interesting places, and the kind of things you find there are incredible. But an awful lot of people remember things from back in the day. Sometimes they write them down or whatever. So it's coming across all of those type of things. The genealogy, and yes, you're absolutely right to mention that, because that's really what I call the sort of the hidden sources, because often, it's a bit like history generally. It's a bit like, anything really. It's often the prominent people at the top of the pyramid, whether it's business, whether it's sport, whether it's entertainment, whether it's politics. Rightly or wrongly, they're always the people who seem to get the last word in. There's an old saying, history is written by the winners. And I think that's probably true. But yeah. But I think the other thing, of course, is that when you speak and interview people who are perhaps, a little bit further down the food chain, working for Capitol Records, for example, they're much more likely to tell you the way it was, because they haven't really got an angle. They haven't got a self-interest. They're not selling a book. They're not doing, they're not promoting themselves. They're just remembering it the way it was. And as I say, a lot of people, mementos, they keep things that they pick up at work and all the rest of it. You should have seen my dad's box when he retired. But yeah, all of those sources come together and produce a book like this, and produce a book like Rasputin. So whatever the subject, that's really how it gets put together, I think.
Yeah.
And so the genealogy story is an interesting one, isn't it? Who did you uncover that sparked this whole book?
Yeah, well, that was, again, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was an accident, but it was a guy called Ray, and again, a friend of mine who is based in the States. That's his bread and butter. He's a genealogist, and yes, he does projects where people come up to him and say, "Oh, can you find out when my grandparents came over from Poland or something, or Lithuania or whatever? They arrived on Ellis Island, but can you trace them back?" So yes, that's a lot of what he does. But also, and you'd know this better than most people, often in the States, in court cases, when they're trying to trace a next of kin and all the rest of it, the court will actually often appoint a genealogist to work on behalf of the court, to trace back and make sure that the person in the will is the right person, or there aren't any other hidden claimants or anything like that. So he was just doing this very mundane job, or so he thought, in California, and he was going through the guy's paperwork and all the rest of it. And again, like me, he's into the Beatles, and he found out in this rummage of paperwork that the guy had worked for Capitol in the 60s. I think he went on to work for Elektra or another couple of labels. But of course, to him, like me and millions of other people, when you hear the word Capitol, you either think of the tower or you think of the Beatles, and that's really what sort of set him rolling. And he dropped me an email. This is back in a long time ago, sort of 2008, 2009, something like that. And he said, "You'll never guess what I've come across. This guy, and he used to work for Capitol Records." So that's really how it all started to move him out. Yeah, but as people have asked me before, that wasn't really the beginning, because it just petered out after that. We interviewed quite a lot of people who told interesting stories, but with the best will in the world, there wasn't enough material there for a whole book. So it really sort of sat in a cupboard, and then COVID came along, and obviously, people like me, millions of other people, were sitting at home looking out the window, wondering what to do. And I thought, yes, a couple of false start books in the cupboard. Let's get them out and start rummaging around. So yeah, that's how it started.
And what exactly was it that was? I teased it at the top. So Denmark Street, for the people who don't know, is an area of Soho in London, which was the buzzing sort of. It was like the Tin Pan Alley, wasn't it?
I was going to say, it's like your Tin Pan Alley, isn't it? All the back in the 60s, back in the 50s, all the big music publishers were either in Denmark Street or just round the corner in Charing Cross Road. So yeah, that was the sort of music place, certainly for publishers.
And exactly, if you can tell us, or you might want to not reveal it, but what was actually said that gave Brian Epstein the leverage over Capitol in Hollywood later? It was on a staircase in Denmark Street, and it was a chancery mark, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there was a guy called Lionel Bart who was
I have his autograph on a napkin.
There we are. Yeah, I mean, he wrote Living Doll, didn't he? And Oliver, you name it. He incredible number of things he wrote. So he was a prolific songwriter, and he knew Brian Epstein as well. And basically, he was a great raconteur. He had 1,000,001 stories. One day he was at his publisher's in Denmark Street, and there was a guy who was over from the States who worked for Leeds Music. Lou Levy was the guy who ran it, but basically the guy got chatting, and he was mentioning, Lou Levy, was down in the dumps for about two months, and he said, what's up with Lou then? So, he got his fingers burnt. He signed this scruffy, hungry-looking kid who had written 2 songs, and he gave him $500. And the kid, he took him to, I think he took him for a cheeseburger somewhere, I can't remember. But anyway, the scruff, he called him the scruffy, hungry-looking kid. He had his first album out, and it bombed. I think they sold about a couple of 100 copies. And the people at the record company, Columbia, or CBS as we know it today, said, John Hammond, what was he thinking about signing that kid? What a waste of time and money. But in the end, he makes good on his second album, and everybody knows him today as Bob Dylan. But basically, Dylan was signed up by a manager not long after that. And the manager found him another publisher. I didn't know about the first publisher. And then once he signed the second publishing contract, Dylan allegedly says, okay, so how does this affect the first contract I've signed? And this guy goes ape. What do you mean? You signed the contract already? This invalidates the thing. So he said, look, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the money. You go down to this guy, Lou Levy, give him a hard luck story and see if he'd be willing to tear up the contract in return for the $500 back. Which he does. Levy is, thinks he's had a second bit of luck because, he lost the money as far as he saw, putting it on this 3-legged horse or something. And so he's happy with his $500. At least he's happy for about 3 months when a little folk group called Peter, Paul and Mary, I think, get to #1 with The Times They Are A-Changing, and then they get another hit as well, written by the same hungry kid, and it's Bob Dylan. So obviously Lou Levy then descends into this sort of mire of depression. He's getting depressed. He thinks everybody's looking over the shoulder at him, saying, "Oh, there goes the guy who threw out Bob Dylan or whatever." But how does that fit into our story? Well, basically, it's a very similar story to a guy called Bob Rowe who worked for Decca and turned down the Beatles. But it was pointed out to Brian Epstein that a friend of his, in New York, I think Jeffrey Ellis, let's try and find Lou Levy, because it later comes out that Levy, apart from being this guy who's suffering from terminal depression, also knows and has known for about 30 years plus a guy called Dave Dexter. And Dave Dexter was one of the top A&R people at Capitol. And in fact, Dave Dexter was the person who kept turning down the Beatles. He turned them down 3 times. So they thought, hello, we've got a result here. This guy Lou Levy, he's anxious to retrieve his reputation, which is in tatters. And secondly, he knows Dave Dexter. So if we can give Lou Levy a taste of something that he wants, he might actually go away and have a whisper in Dave Dexter's ear, which is exactly what happens. Not quite that simple. It's just really crunching the story, but it's all about who I guess. And
wow, and literally because of Lou Levy's failure with letting Bob Dylan slip through his fingers, he would twice or 3 times as keen to make 2 and 2 into 5, wouldn't he?
Well, you've got it, and that's really what happened to Bob Rowe in England. I mean, he got a real trashing reputation-wise for turning down the Beatles in early '62, and it's one of the reasons why he grabbed the Rolling Stones with open arms. He actually hated the sight of them and hated the sound of them even more. But they were the gateway to restoring his reputation. Or so he thought. And it's exactly the same with Lou Levy. He saw this as redemption time. And what was his reward? Well, they persuaded him into putting $40,000 on the table to say to Capitol, if you sign the Beatles, I'll pay for the promotion of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which was the first single that Capitol put out.
A lot of money.
$40,000. It's massive money these days. And
Yeah.
so what did he get back for it? Because obviously, like any good businessman, what's in it for me? Apart from a new reputation, but he was given the publishing rights for the single "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and he was also given the publishing rights for Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison songs in Southeast Asia for 5 years. And if you sort of roll the dice a bit further, later in '64. What we used to call American Decca, or Universal now, actually wanted to get into publishing. They were one of the big movie studios that didn't have a publisher, publishing company. So they went and they decided quite wisely to buy Leeds and Duchess Music. That's Lou Levy's company. Even today, allegedly, the figure that changed hands for is unknown, but it's allegedly the biggest purchase figure for a publishing company in music history. So old Lou Levy, he was a winner 3 times over as a result of doing everybody a good turn.
Yeah, fool me once, shame on me. All right, fool me, yeah, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, really, I've screwed up. So he just wasn't going to do that, was he?
No, and as I say, he's the man that nobody's ever really heard of in all of these kind of Beatles stories. But hey, I don't think he was the sort of guy who really wanted his name up in lights. He'd saved his reputation, built himself a new reputation, and become a multi-millionaire as a result of selling Lee's music. He becomes head, by the way, of Universal. So it's not like he's pensioned off. He becomes, the head of Universal. And
what a great redemption story, though.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I mean, I wasn't aware as a child that records were released differently in the States. And was reading your fabulous book.
Yeah, well, F.L. Moore's record shop was where you discovered the Beatles, wasn't it?
The records, yeah. As I say, I probably discovered the Beatles in my cousin's upstairs bedroom. But in terms of the actual records themselves, because I mean, again, at 6 or 7, I shouldn't really say this, but I couldn't tell the difference between the Beatles and Dave Clark and the Monkees when I was 6. But edit that out of the interview. But I'm only kidding. But F.L. Moore's was really where I started to learn about the Beatles, and it was it was
back in just like a local record store.
Well, yeah, I mean, local record stores in I don't know, the 50s and 60s were almost not exactly corner shops, but they weren't massive. The ones that sold pianos and all the rest of it, but even the record section wasn't very big. F.L. Moore's was like a supermarket, I mean, it's absolutely mind blowing. And I went in there one day after it opened just to have a look around, and I think my mum and dad thought I'd gone missing. I was in there all day, but it was while I was in there that I was kind of thumbing through the Beatles albums. And I'd seen most of them before in other record shops, but then I stumbled across these Capitol ones. And the thing about Moore's was that, unlike all the other record shops I'd ever been in, they actually imported stuff from the States. So I thought, wow, the Beatles, I know all about the Beatles, but I'd never seen this album before. What's all that about? So that's really how I got an introduction to that. Yeah. The bug started there. Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I think it was probably till 72. I was a huge David Cassidy Partridge Family fan, and Paul, God bless him, my stepbrother, got David on the phone, and I was listening in, apoplectic. I couldn't even speak, and so Paul rang. David was in London doing I don't know, whatever tour, and he was staying at the Dorchester, and he was logged in under David Jackson because his father was Jack Cassidy and he was Jack's son. David Jack's son.
Yeah.
Paul eventually gets through Ruth Aarons, and I'm listening on the extension, and he gets through and he says, "Is this David? David Bruce was his middle name. That was the key. That was the key, so that David knew that And he said, "It might be. Who's this?" And he said, "Well, this is Paul, Paul McCartney." And Cassidy goes, "Yeah, and I'm the effing Duke of Edinburgh," and hung up the phone. So we eventually get back through. I'm too weak to speak. I'm almost shaking and almost throwing up. And so Paul said, "Well, my little sister Ruth, she's 12. Could you send an autograph and maybe the latest LP?" Well, because of that call, I got Partridge Family records that weren't released in the United Kingdom. I still have them today. That was literally when I was aware that there were US versions and UK versions. I mean, here I am growing up in a house, full of the Beatles, and it never even really occurred to me that there'd be different territories and different releases. So it's funny, isn't it, when the light bulb goes on and you go, hang on, I haven't seen this one.
Absolutely right. And I mean, again, to start with, when I stumbled across these things, I thought, oh, it must just be the Beatles. But almost everybody, the Stones had different albums and tracks out. Jimi Hendrix, you pick up, Jimi Hendrix's first album. It's called Are You Experienced? But that's about the only thing that the two versions have got in common. Sleeves are different. A number of the tracks are different. Even going back to the 50s in England, the sort of albums that my older cousins were buying of Elvis in the late 50s.
Yes.
They were different, Elvis Presley #2. I mean, that's not an album you could pick up in the States. So, it happened right across the board, and it made sense, commercial sense. You repackage something to do well in that particular country. You dovetail the product to fit the country. So, so that was
different singles in different countries, don't they? They used to flip the order of the tracks on records too.
Oh, absolutely right. And, you look at Australia. I mean, people say, Australia, they stuck more or less to the parlophone format. Well, kind of. They did change album sleeves, but they put out a hell of a lot more singles, parlophone in Australia than they did in the UK. They used a couple of Capitol sleeves as well. The Beatles 65 and Beatles 6, they use those in Australia. So wherever you go in the world, you'll find that everything is packaged for that audience,
Yeah. And I think too with radio, we use something called radio.garden. It's a website that's conglomeration of ideas between Google Earth and the University of Hilversum in Holland. And there's a little green dot for every radio station. And I've sort of come to the idea that the more concentrated the amount of radio there is in any given country, the more singles they release, because that's their marketing. If you can get on the radio, even to this day, people still listen to the radio.
Absolutely. And you've made a good point there, because radio was one of the massive differences between America and Britain in the 60s. Okay, pirate radio. But I mean, that only kicked in 64, after Beatles went to the States. The BBC, not being anti-BBC, of course not. But I mean, it was pretty dry and dusty. They only allowed a few pop records on a day. They had a thing called Needle Time, all the rest of it. It was dull as dust. And when you look at what's going on in America at the time, the pop and rock stations, it's a different planet. And people like Capitol and all RCA Victor, all these people, the records, they had plenty of reverb and volume, because that's what went over on the radio. So that's another reason why they were slightly remixed in America, to give them that sort of in-your-face, loud, echoey sort of radio feel, because that's how the record sold. Get it played on the radio.
Well, and also the size of the country. When you think back, England's fairly small, and you've got Auntie Beeb, and you have to have a license. And if you want a television or a radio, you're going to be listening to the propaganda that they put on, Radio 1. I think it was Radio 1, 2, and 3 and 4. That was it. But nobody listened to 3 and 4 was all classical, right?
That's radio. Yeah. That's a home service, which we now call Radio 4. I don't know how many people listen to that. Probably about 5 or 6. I'm not sure. But and then you had what they called the third service, which was classical, which is now Radio 3. Then there was the light service, which is now Radio 2. And of course, Radio 1 didn't exist until 1967. That was sort of pop and rock stuff. So it's like two different universes, not two different planets. And
but so as a band coming up, as the challenge for Brian would have been, you've got to get on to the light program on BBC 2. But if you're playing all of this rock and roll, well, good luck with that. And so, and also you think about the size of America and the amount of time people spend in their cars, which is where you consume most radio. Of course, it was going to explode here, because it takes 3 days to drive from one side, 4 days to drive from one side of the country to the other. People didn't have cell phones, so of course the radio towers are going to go up.
That's it, and that was the key.
Marianne's just saying this is the nitty gritty of the music business. Great stuff. Thanks, Marianne. There's so much goes on behind the scenes that the average consumer doesn't think about. It's like when you walk into a restaurant and sit down and the plate's put in front of you, you don't think about where it all came from and what it took to get it there. And it's the same with the music business. So in your book, Capital Gains, it draws on corporate and personal archives. What was the most revealing document or memo or fact that you found, and how does it change the reader's understanding of how Capitol Records sort of finally said yes to Levy?
Sure. That's a difficult question. I think there were so many documents and things I found. I mean, Dave Dexter, the guy, who effectively was their producer in America and eventually decided to sign them. He wrote down almost everything. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say he wrote down what he had for breakfast every day, but I mean, he recorded everything he was going through his head when he's producing these records. As I say, I think in a way that one question's got two sides to it. In terms of document, I think the other is full of myths. I think these stories, and I always say that history of music is no different to the Romans or the Saxons or the Battle of Hastings. History is history. History is history. And it's full of old myths, Harold and the arrow in his eye and all that nonsense. There was a story among these many myths that EMI got so cheesed off in London with Capitol not agreeing to put the thing out that Joseph Lockwood or whoever, according to the story that's being told, gets on the blower, gets on the phone and lets them have a right mouthful. We own you. You've better put this out. Load of old nonsense. That Capitol got the best out of the deal in 1955. They might have been bought by EMI, but EMI were buying them from a position of weakness. So they actually got a really good contract where effectively they got a shed load of money that they invested in what they were doing from EMI, but they also had a couple of clauses in the contract that basically said, we run our own business. You don't tell us what to do. You don't even tell us what records we have to listen to or put out. So Capitol had every right to say, thanks very much, but no, we don't think that group's going to run. And as I say, it was only because Dave Dexter, who was really the main person who was turning them down, he was the guy that Alan Livingston, the company president, always turned to for advice. And if he said, no, this band isn't going to fly, then that was the end of the conversation. So I think the first part of the answer is, yes, it was the Levy connection that mellowed Dexter. The 40 grand didn't hurt either. But I think the things really that raised eyebrows with me was, and again, this isn't a criticism at all, the sheer commerciality of the whole thing. When for example, they were looking to put out a soundtrack on Help, and so they were trying to edit it all together. They were quite desperate because all of the songs that were on the B side of the UK album had been frittered away already. So you had to find another side to make this album fly. And that was where, he's listening to he's up day and night listening to the soundtrack and, various noises and burbles and all the rest of it, and a bit of cut from James Bond and everything else. So, they were very cost conscious. And this is, in a way, the book's almost about, it's like, heaven and hell, really. Yes, it's about the success of Capitol, but it also says, well, EMI and Parlophone, they would have probably gone bust eventually if they did in 2011, but I mean they would have gone bust a lot earlier if it wasn't for the Beatles. There was always this thing on EMI albums, the greatest recording organization in the world. They weren't even the greatest recording organization in Britain, let alone the world in the 50s and 60s. I mean, we all take the 12-inch album. EMI were the last people on the planet to go with the 12-inch album. They argued hook, line and sinker that it's never going to catch on. It's a bit like people years ago said emails, the internet, it's never going to catch on. But it did catch on, and EMI were left way behind. So that's the thing that interested me, all these memos, the kind of, I mean, you've probably seen, I'm sure, and a lot of the people listening have probably seen Mad Men, totally different thing, but it's about advertising industry. And you might remember, folk listening might remember that, halfway through these series, the agency that Don works for is bought by this snooty old company in England. And you've got this irony where, the company on Madison Avenue is being run by these way out of touch guys in London. What's going on? And it's the same thing here. Capital were a cutting edge company. If you go back to the 40s, they were a startup company. They had two offices above a record shop in Hollywood and Vine. Fast forward 15 years, and they're one of the top companies in the country. The directors are living next door to Marilyn Monroe and all the rest of it. So it's even without the Beatles, it's a fascinating old story about Capitol.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah. Well, as I read it, Capitol remixed UK masters and built distinct US albums, didn't they? It's PR.
That's it. Yeah, they did. And they did two things differently. I mean, one was they repackaged the songs. So that on the whole, in England, you get 2 Beatles albums a year. In the States, they were looking for 4. 3, but they were really looking for 4. And they did this by getting George Martin to record a few numbers purely for the American albums, but also using singles and B-sides. So when you put it all together, give you one example: Beatles for Sale. Obviously in England, that's one album, but Beatles 65 and Beatles 6 in America is almost like Beatles for Sale Part 1, Beatles for Sale Part 2. They slimmed them. So they were very savvy. And yes, I say in the book, it's Capitol who make the Beatles rich beyond their wildest dreams. But you could turn it around and say, yeah, okay, that's true, but the Beatles actually made Capitol rich beyond their wildest dreams.
It takes 2 to tango, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
But how did those commercial choices that Capitol made clash with the band and Brian's, instincts and artistic
instinct?
And artistic, where do you see the line between savvy marketing and artistic compromise? I mean, how did they just have the power in the contract to force Brian and the Beatles?
They did to start, and it was a blurry line, I think, at the best of times. I mean, it's almost similar story to the Beatles' relationship with Brian Epstein. To start off, of course, he was like the teacher and they were the pupils, and the balance of power shifted. I mean, Tony Barrow is on record as saying 1966 marks, the sea change. After 66, it's really during 66 on so many issues. It's the Beatles telling Epstein what's going on, and he's having to sort of run behind the car. It's the same thing with Capitol. To start off with, of course, the Beatles were only too pleased to have got Capitol to sign a record deal
in America.
Yeah, and although I think it's definitely true to say that different members of the band had different reservations to different extents about the Capitol albums, I think equally they all knew full well that whatever their personal views about the albums were, that each and every one of these albums was actually going to make an absolute fortune. Fortune. So
who've grown up with parents who've said things like, you know which side your bread's buttered, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think in terms of Capitol, the bread was buttered on both sides, because these albums actually sold massive numbers, absolutely massive numbers. And of course, the other big thing in the States, you quite rightly mentioned radio, but once the Beatles get into their stride in the States, it's not playing to dance halls or even theaters. It's baseball and football stadiums. And apart from making absolute massive money, because you're playing to 50, 60,000 people sometimes, it's also the biggest advert for vinyl that you can get. People, all these thousands of youngsters come along to the baseball stadium, and what are they doing? Are they hearing the music? That's another argument. But I mean, they're picking up, this is from Beatles 6, this is from Beatles 65, this is from the new album, called Rubber Soul, whatever. So what's the second thing they do? They run down the record store and buy one. So
I saw a video of John Lennon I think it was a Dick Cavett interview. Once the Beatles had broken up, it was John and Yoko, and John was saying, the irony is the more successful that the Beatles got, we started playing 8 hours a night in Hamburg, an hour on, an hour off, an hour on, an hour off, and we were literally on and off stage for 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that was in a small club to, maybe 150 people if you were lucky.
Yeah.
But then they started doing, they came home and they did sort of 2 45-minute sets in these working men clubs. And then they got to open for like Frankie Lane and, Ken Todd, people like that. And then they said, oh, well, we only need, you're the opener. We only need 40 minutes. And then he said, then you get to Shea Stadium. He said that the set was like, 22 minutes long. And we couldn't hear it anyway. He said, the more famous we got, the less people we got to play. And that we got into the business because we loved playing the music, not necessarily for 16 hours at a stretch, but it would be nice to have a happy medium. But all of the things coming into play with the security, the logistics, the travel, the radio, the labels, the management, whatever, you didn't in the end know which tail was wagging what dog, did you?
No, I think it must have become, and only those who were, to coin that old phrase, at the center of the storm, would know it. But I think it became, within 2.5 years, it went from heaven to hell, and it was really something that they found very difficult to cope with by the time you got to the end of, say, 65, early 66. So whilst it made massive money, Taurian made massive money, it was a great advert for the records. Something had to give, and I think that's why they made the decision. But I mean, Capitol, didn't like the idea, and in fact, when they said to Brian Epstein, "Oh, we've heard rumours that there might not be any shows after this year," "Oh, don't worry, chaps. I've got another booking for Shea Stadium in '67." Well, that wasn't a complete lie. He did actually have a contract for Shea Stadium in '67, but he knew very well that he was never going to be allowed to sign it. So, yeah.
I mean, something had to give, but in a way, because they hated, well, they didn't hate touring, but it wasn't fulfilling as artists. It wasn't why they got into the business. It wasn't what they weren't doing what they loved. But had it not been for the rigors of all of that, they wouldn't have then done a 180 and gone into the studio and created, the White Album and the Sgt. Pepper and all of that. The touring and the early Capitol stuff gave them the funds to be able to say, all right, we're coming off the road and we're going to go focus in the studio and create all this great music. So you don't get that without the other, do you?
Yeah.
Oh no, I mean, again, it's like history. History generally, one thing leads to another. It's a knock-on effect. It's the domino theory. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you can't have one bit without the other, it's all connected. If you try and see one bit in isolation, you're looking at it with one eye shut. Everything follows on. It's like our lives, isn't it? I mean, if you take out a part of your life, then the rest of it isn't going to be the same. So I think that, yeah, you're right. That's what happened.
I tell you what, I wanted to ask you about the year 1963. Figures a lot, doesn't it, in your book? That was the year that was. How do you see that pivotal year shaping both Britain's cultural mood, and the Beatles' rise in fame?
Yeah, I think I actually wrote a book about 1963. But anyway, the reason I wrote the book was that, to me, and I just about remember 63. I remember the terrible winter of 63, and my dad took me for a walk on a lake and said, remember this, because you're never ever in your lifetime going to be walking on a lake again. And he was right. But 63, I mean, people talk about the 60s, they talk about the 50s. These are kind of really lazy generalities, because the first 3 years of the 60s, 60, 61, 62, had a lot more in common with the 50s. The 60s don't really start until 1963, in the same way that arguably the 1950s didn't start until about 1954. Before that, it was again 50, 51, 52. It was more like the 1940s.
Post-war, yeah.
There was rationing until 53, whatever. Yep. So I think a lot of things, an awful lot of things happen in 63. It's almost like a decade crunched down into 1 year. So we'd be here for several days if we talked about 1963. But I think, yes, it is the watershed. Not just because of the Beatles, but because of 100 Profumo, all these other things that happened in 63. It really jump starts the 1960s.
And it was in November of 63 that Brian flew to New York and actually did the deal for Ed Sullivan later on that year. It was like 2 weeks before JFK was assassinated. And so, we've talked about this with other authors. I think it's just a breath of fresh air. They, you know, America had the worst Thanksgiving, the worst Christmas, the worst whatever. Their president had been murdered in broad daylight. I think when the Beatles, you know, came to in that February, they landed. I think it was just like almost like, oh, we needed this, you know.
Yeah, I think so, because, you know, music doesn't deliberately set out to reflect life, but it does, and I think even when it's not intending to, you know, it's kind of the soundtrack to everybody's lives, isn't it? You know, that's a phrase I picked up a little while ago. It's the soundtrack to our lives, and certainly the 60s were. So I think, you know, a lot of things happening. People remember Vietnam. I mean, it was almost like, you know, 24-hour day news channel, the 1960s. It was, you know, whatever else it was, it didn't suffer from, you know, nothing going on. Quite the opposite. It was literally every 5 minutes something earth-breaking was happening.
Yeah. I mean, you've also, because obviously you're a historian and an author first, and the Beatles just happened to pop into your, you know, cadre of books. You've written a lot of books, 16 books. So you obviously have a, you know, great affinity for history. You know, we were wondering, so a lot of your stuff has been turned into film and television. What is the road for that like? And
do you envision Capital Gains being made into a documentary or a series?
Well, I've no idea. I think that with the Beatles, I mean, it's almost like Agatha Christie, isn't it? The number of books written about and this kind of made me think to start with. Even though I was mad keen to do it, I thought, well, is there really space on this planet for another Beatles book? You know, it's almost like grass growing through the paving stones. You know, there's, you know, Blink, and there's another couple of Beatles books. And again, I've got my share of them on my shelf at home. So I did think, you know, but I've always taken the view, because I mean, the publishers kind of suggest to people, oh, why don't you write a book about this? Why don't you write a book about that? And I've always said, well, I only really write about something if I think there's something reasonably new to say. You know, I don't think authors should be like photocopiers, you know, oh, knock me off a book about the Gestapo, or knock me off a book about, you know, this, that, and the other. Yeah. So, you know, to me, the capital thing was something that had fascinated me since about the age of 10, 11. So I just wanted to write it, you know. Whether it would ever be made a documentary, I don't know. Because I say one thing, the world is not. We've got a lot of shortages in the world, but we haven't got a shortage of Beatles on the TV, even many years later. And I think, you know, when you think about it, you know, if you fast forward, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I think people will still be talking about the Beatles, even then. And, you know, if you shrink it all down, I'd say, I'm not a classical fan, by the way, but, you know, Mozart, Beethoven and the Beatles, they're the three music acts that have lasted a hell of a long time. And I think they'll roll on. I think they'll all roll, those three acts will all roll on into the future decades.
I hope you're right.
No, absolutely. And, you know, we've got, I don't know, a few hundred Beatles books. And I would like to also, I'm sure he's watching somewhere, John Bazzini, who put us together. Buzz is just an incredible collector. Yeah. I mean, he's got a definitive collection of but he doesn't collect first, he collects last. When we put out Angie's book that I illustrated, I did all the digital painting. It's called There Are Faces I Remember. And we pressed 1,000. We were going to press 1,000 copies. And they're all numbered on it with a picture on the back, signed and everything. And Buzz contacted Angie and said, well, can you press one, if you've sold them, can you press one more? Because I'd like to buy number 1001. So we got all So Buzz has got the most incredible collection, and thank God finds people like you who with great books and fascinating stories. So thanks to him for that. But if you could spend an afternoon interviewing one person from Beatles history, not necessarily the band members themselves, it was past or present, who might that be? Who do you think?
You ask really tough questions.
I know,
really tough questions. Oh my word. I think it would probably be Brian Epstein, I think, to be honest. But there's so many, you could answer that question 10 times over, couldn't you, with so many people who were flies on the wall. I think Brian Epstein is the most obvious answer, but I think if I had a second choice, it would probably be somebody who was like a fly on the wall, because often it's the flies on the wall who are just that. They're there watching and listening, not necessarily taking part, but yeah.
Professor Kenneth Womack's just written a fabulous book about Mal Evans.
I've read that. It's a good book. Yeah.
But, it's like
and as much as I thought I knew Mal, that book taught me an awful lot that I didn't.
Yeah.
So,
there's always the story behind the story, which I think for somebody like you who's rooted in history all the way from the Romanovs to the when you wrote your first book, I suppose you just, as a writer, you don't know the arc, you don't know what's coming next. You probably never thought I'll be writing from Romanovs to the Beatles, right?
Well, I didn't even think I'd be writing at all. I mean, the first book really just started off where I was at a few weeks off, and I was, you might remember it, I don't know if it's on in the States, but there was a series called Reilly, Ace of Spies, starring Sam Neill, who's the guy who made it in Jurassic Park. I think that was his big break. But before he did Jurassic Park, he played Sidney Reilly. Yeah. So I read a book about Sidney Reilly, or read two books actually, and they were both, it sounded like both about two different people. I thought, which one is true and which one isn't? Turned out neither of them were really true. But I started to just poke around and do a little bit of research. And I was, as I tend to do even today, I mean, if you could see my house, my floor is often spread with paper, because I just chuck it all on the floor and put it in piles. And my sister said, cool, you've got enough paper there to write a book. I thought, there's an idea. So, that's how it started. But I never ever thought I'd do more than one. But there we are. That's another sort of thought. But yeah, you just go with the flow, I think. And I'm just somebody who's once I'm curious about certain things, and then when I find there's a load of paperwork on it buried away somewhere, then I start knocking on the door and making a nuisance of myself in the nicest possible way. But like the Great Train Robbery, I mean, I remember reading about that as a kid, and we used to live not far from where the Great Train Robbery happened, so my parents were always talking about it. And I often used to think, maybe somewhere, hundreds of miles away on some beach is a guy who got away with the Great Train Robbery, drinking his pina colada or something. And I never thought that, 20, 30 years later, I'd actually, be thumbing through a bunch of paperwork that gave the names of these 4 guys who did sort of walk between the raindrops and get totally away with it. So
between the raindrops, I like that.
I like that. Yeah,
was right. Ronnie Biggs is one of the names that rings a bell with me.
He is, but again, he was probably, he came into the gang at the very last minute and arguably played a very, very tiny role in it. And I think that's why a lot of the other people in the gang were just a little bit peeved over the years, because Ronnie Biggs was getting all the publicity. And again, as you say, whenever people mention Great Train Robbery, Ronnie Biggs,
Ronnie Biggs, the first
so
name.
Them off no end, that whenever people mentioned it was Ronnie Biggs who got all the chat on the limelight, whereas really he was just like a walk-on part in the last 5 minutes kind of thing.
If that's funny, because as a kid, the impression I had was when we first got color TV in 1969, one of the things I remember watching was him strolling down a beach in Brazil or Argentina or somewhere with a big gold chain and 2 dusky maidens in bikinis. And he was the big man on campus. So he definitely managed to make a name for himself out of that brand.
And he also got to make I think a couple of records with the Sex Pistols as well, from memory of 1976, didn't he? But yeah, I mean, it's another lesson in the sense that things ain't always what they seem, I think. No. But yeah, he made a name and a reputation for himself over many years. Yeah. But as I say, actually, he was a very tiny cog in the engine. But that is the way the public perceive things, I think.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, looking back, the '60s there were a lot of memorable cover of Time magazine headlines, as I like to call them. And ending with the man walking on the moon. We met Buzz Aldrin once upon a time at a British American Chamber of Commerce did the deal. And he was very gracious and took pictures with us all. And I said to him, I said, so must be really frustrating being the first man on the moon, but having to say you were the second man on the moon. And he looked at me and I said, well, okay, who was holding the camera when Neil Armstrong came down the steps? And you were seated, you were in full dress and you were seated by the door. He couldn't have climbed over you. And he said, well, it's been lovely meeting you. I got to go now.
And I asked him almost the same question a little later. And he said, oh, I see somebody I must talk to. Been lovely meeting you. And off it went.
Yeah, another fascinating story about the moon landing.
But the 60s was quite the thing. And I've honestly never heard or read a book about Capital and the inner workings. So well done you. Capital Gains is an absolute must read for all our Beatle fan collector listeners.
And the smashing title.
Oh, the title.
Capital Gains.
Another accident. You know, when I first mentioned it to somebody, they said, we don't publish accountancy books. I said, it's not about accountancy, Capital Gains, but there we are.
So you guys will see, if you rewind this interview, you'll see scrolling across the bottom, you can find this lovely man at his website, andrewcook.org.uk. And also, just go there and have a look at some of the other amazing books about, some of these people that we've talked about, the 60s and beyond, the Romanovs, even before that. So it's been an absolute real pleasure. Once again, thanks to Buzz Bazzini for putting us together today. And you may not know this, Andrew, but our regular viewers will know Angie is known as the Limerick Lady. And she has written a personal limerick just for you for sign off. So are you sitting comfortably?
I'm at the moment anyway.
Then we shall begin. I'll let you count it.
1, 2, 3.
There once was an author named Cook who uncovered some myths in his book. From Denmark Street's spark to Capital's mark, he shows how the states bit the hook. Ta-da! There we go.
Well done.
So thank you again so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you. The pleasure's been all mine. It's been marvelous, coming on today, and thank you so much for it.
Our absolute pleasure. And you will be able to see this back at the McCartney Times at mccartney.com and on our TeaFlix Tuesdays YouTube channel. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please give us a subscribe. It helps us out. It's absolutely free. Just click the subscribe and the like button, and we will see you kids all of a sudden.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.